You imagine a medieval castle as a place of grandeur, towering walls, glittering halls, ladies in silk, and noble feasts. But the shocking truth is that for women, these castles were not fairy tale palaces. They were prisons in stone, places where your body, your marriage, and even your survival were controlled by men. Behind the tapestries and heavy doors, life was marked by childbirth dangers, forced unions, lack of privacy, and brutal expectations of obedience. A castle, in many ways, was not a sanctuary for women. It was a cage, gilded but suffocating. If you were born into nobility, your fate was sealed before you could even speak. You belonged not to yourself, but to your father, then your husband, and eventually your sons. And the worst part, no one would see this as cruelty. To them, it was simply the natural order of life. So in this exploration, we'll uncover what life was really like for women inside those massive medieval castles. You'll see how arranged marriages turned girls into bargaining chips, how pregnancy and childbirth often meant a gamble with death, and how even queens lived under suffocating control. We'll look at the brutal routines, the hidden labor, the lack of privacy, and the political weight that crushed women's choices. You'll learn about shocking facts that are rarely told, the secret punishments, the forced isolation, and the silent suffering behind castle walls. By the end, you'll see the medieval castle not as a romantic dream, but as a brutal reality for women trapped within it. But before we dive in, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from tonight? Is it late at night? Are you lying down? Or maybe you're just closing your eyes after a long day? My channel is built to bring you forgotten histories like this, stories that reveal what life was really like, especially for women who history often silenced. If you're fascinated by these hidden truths, make sure to subscribe, because together we'll uncover even more of these shocking realities. Now, let's step through the gates of a medieval castle, not as a guest of honor, but as a woman who had no choice but to live there. Imagine you are a young girl, perhaps only 12 or 13, walking into a towering castle courtyard for the first time. You are not here for adventure. You are here because your father has arranged your marriage. For him, you are a pawn in political games or an alliance sealed with your body. You do not get to choose whom you marry, whether he is kind, cruel, young, or old. For many noblewomen, the wedding day was not a celebration of love. It was the beginning of captivity, a binding contract where you ceased to exist as an individual. In the eyes of the law and the church, you were now entirely your husband's possession. Even your lands, dowry, and wealth were transferred into his control, leaving you with no independence. Inside the castle, privacy was almost non-existent. You might picture private chambers and peaceful gardens, but the reality was constant surveillance. Servants, guards, and other members of the household were always nearby, and your life was never your own. The castle was filled with noise, duties, and watchful eyes. Even in your most personal moments, whether eating, sleeping, or even during childbirth, you were rarely alone. Your body was not private. It was expected to produce heirs, and if you failed to bear sons, whispers of failure would follow you through every corridor. For women, the castle walls were not a shield of protection. They were stone reminders that freedom did not belong to you. And then there was the danger of childbirth itself. In an age with no advanced medicine, giving birth was the most perilous event in a woman's life. Noblewomen were often expected to produce many children, yet every pregnancy brought the risk of fever, infection, or death. Midwives and herbs offered little defense against complications. Even queens died in childbirth, their lives cut short in their duty to produce heirs. Imagine the constant fear that with every pregnancy, your life might end, and yet you had no choice but to try again and again. For castle women, childbirth was not only painful, it was a brutal gamble with death, repeated until their bodies were worn out. What made this worse was how invisible women's suffering was. Chronicles recorded kings, knights, and wars, but women's lives were barely mentioned unless they became scandalous. Their struggles were hidden behind walls, ignored by the outside world. You could be a lady of high rank, dressed in silk, yet still be voiceless. Your opinions rarely mattered in politics, and your ability to change your fate was slim, unless you were exceptionally powerful, like Eleanor of Aquitaine. Most noblewomen lived and died quietly, their stories lost to time. And yet, behind those walls, every woman endured a private war, against forced duty, against constant fear, against a life that was never truly theirs. So, when we peel back the romantic myths of medieval castles, we find something darker. Women trapped in duty, stripped of freedom, and often sacrificed to the demands of power. But this is only the beginning of the story, because beyond marriage and childbirth, the castle demanded endless labor, emotional endurance, and loyalty that could cost a woman everything. And in the next part, we'll step deeper into those chambers and uncover the hidden burdens women carried every single day. Step further into the castle, and you'll see that survival for women meant more than enduring arranged marriages or childbirth. Daily life inside was exhausting and relentless. The grand halls and tapestries may suggest comfort, but those were a facade. Behind the beauty, women carried the burden of running the castle household. As the lady of the castle, you were responsible for everything: food stores, servants, textiles, accounts, and sometimes even medical care. Imagine waking each morning to a list of endless duties. You had to ensure bread was baked, wine was stored, livestock managed, servants disciplined, and guests hosted. And all this while still being expected to look graceful and obedient. The castle wasn't a home, it was a small kingdom, and its women were unpaid managers of its survival. But unlike a king, you received no glory for your work. Running a castle meant living under constant scrutiny. Every action was judged by others, from the servants who whispered in corners to the men who measured your worth by your obedience. If you faltered, your failures spread like wildfire within the walls. Worse still, women were often blamed for misfortune. If the castle ran out of food during a siege, if servants grew unruly, or if the lord's household fell into disarray, suspicion turned toward you. The responsibility was immense, but the recognition non-existent. You carried a burden that could break even the strongest spirit, yet history rarely recorded your name. In many ways, the silence of chronicles is the loudest testimony to the brutal invisibility women faced. And this burden wasn't limited to even the lowest maid or servant girl inside the castle lived under constant exhaustion. She rose before dawn, hauling water from the well, tending fires, scrubbing laundry in icy rivers, and cleaning the lord's hall until her body ached. For these women, the castle was not a place of opportunity, but of servitude. Many were beaten for small mistakes, given little rest, and lived in shared, cold quarters. Some were even at the mercy of male masters, vulnerable to exploitation without protection. Imagine being a young servant girl, trapped inside these stone walls, unable to leave, your body and labor treated as possessions. Life was not romantic in a castle. It was a chain of survival tasks that left little room for joy. And yet, one of the most shocking truths of castle life was how isolated women were. Despite the castle being full of people, from knights to cooks to guards, women lived in confinement. Travel was rare, friendships limited, and freedom of movement nearly impossible. Unlike men, who rode into battle or traveled for diplomacy, women were expected to stay inside. For weeks, months, sometimes years, a woman might never leave the thick stone walls. Isolation was its own kind of prison, cutting women off from the outside world, leaving them trapped in the monotony of the castle's daily grind. And when isolation combined with constant surveillance, it meant there was little space for individuality to even exist. The atmosphere itself was suffocating. Castles were cold, damp, and dimly lit by smoky torches. Privacy was nearly impossible, as servants and guards moved in and out of rooms constantly. Your chamber, filled with heavy wooden furniture and drafty windows, may have looked impressive, but it was far from comfortable. The air was filled with the smell of unwashed bodies, smoke, and animals from the courtyards below. Disease spread quickly in these tight quarters, and women were often the ones nursing the sick. In these conditions, every day was a battle against the elements, illness, and fatigue. The so-called romance of castle life melts away when you realize how brutal and joyless the physical environment could be for its women. And when danger came, the castle became a terrifying place for women. During sieges, women endured starvation, fear, and violence. They were not protected behind the walls. They suffered alongside everyone else. Food shortages often meant women gave up their rations for men, especially soldiers. And if the castle fell, women were among the most vulnerable victims, facing plunder, captivity, or worse. Stories of sieges in medieval chronicles often describe women and children huddled in fear, praying that the gates would hold. The same walls that trapped them in daily life now trapped them in mortal danger. For women, the castle was never truly a refuge. All of this meant that, for women, castle life was not only physically demanding, but emotionally crushing. You were expected to bear the weight of responsibility, endure constant judgment, live in isolation, and survive in harsh conditions, all while remaining silent, obedient, and graceful. This constant pressure made women's lives a cycle of invisible suffering. Yet, this was only part of the brutality. Beyond the daily routines and physical hardships, women faced another, darker reality: the loss of autonomy over their own bodies and desires. And in the next part, we'll step into that shadow, into the world of control, obedience, and silence that defined a woman's most private existence inside the castle walls. If there was one thing that defined a woman's life in a medieval castle, it was the loss of control over her own body. From the moment you were married, your body no longer belonged to you. The church, the law, and your husband all agreed that it was his right to demand your submission. Marital consent, as we understand it today, did not exist. If your husband wanted children, heirs, or simply to assert his authority, you were expected to obey. Refusal could mean accusations of disobedience, scandal, or even violence. In a society where silence and obedience were the marks of a good wife, resistance was dangerous. Imagine living with the constant knowledge that even in your own chamber, your most private self was never yours to protect. Beyond the marriage bed, the expectations of purity and chastity were suffocating. Noblewomen were often closely guarded, their movements monitored to prevent even the suggestion of impropriety. A rumor of unfaithfulness could ruin not only your reputation but your family's political standing. Women could be locked away, punished, or cast aside for suspicion alone. Meanwhile, men were rarely judged by the same standards. Husbands often kept mistresses or visited brothels with little consequence, while wives lived under constant surveillance. This double standard was one of the cruelest aspects of castle life. Your body was both demanded and controlled, yet your choices over it were erased. For women, freedom of desire was forbidden. And what of love? Romance, as we imagine it today, rarely played a role in castle marriages. These unions were transactions, binding families and securing alliances. Women were expected to show loyalty and obedience, not affection or passion. In fact, many women endured cold or abusive marriages with no hope of escape. Divorce was nearly impossible, annulments rare, and separation meant disgrace. Even queens had little power to free themselves from unhappy unions. Instead, they endured, often finding solace only in secret, through friendships, poetry, or sometimes forbidden affairs. But the risk was enormous. A woman discovered in infidelity could be punished with imprisonment, exile, or death. Castles were full of silent stories of women who longed for love but were trapped in chains of duty. Control over women's bodies extended even to their fertility. Bearing children was not a choice, it was a demand. Failure to produce sons, especially heirs, was seen as a woman's failure, regardless of her husband's health or fertility. This crushing expectation meant repeated pregnancies, often with little care for a woman's health. Some women bore 10, 12, or even 15 children over their lifetimes, enduring cycle after cycle of risk. If you failed to conceive, whispers of barrenness haunted you. And if you gave birth only to daughters, your worth was quietly diminished. Your womb was your value, and when it failed in the eyes of men, so did you. Imagine the terror of knowing your very survival in the castle depended on your ability to survive childbirth again and again. Women also bore the weight of obedience beyond the personal sphere. In politics, they were tools to strengthen alliances, not participants with voices of their own. Even Queen's consort, surrounded by splendor, lived under the authority of their husbands. When they did try to assert influence, like Isabella of France or Eleanor of Aquitaine, they were seen as dangerous, disruptive, even unnatural. Castles, those towering symbols of power, were designed to glorify male dominance. Women who dared to rise above obedience often faced resistance, slander, or violent retribution. The message was clear: your duty was to support, not to rule. And so, most women lived quietly, their ambitions suppressed by the unyielding weight of expectation. Perhaps the most brutal truth is how normalized this control was. No one questioned it, because the system was designed to reinforce it at every level. The church preached obedience as a holy duty. Fathers and husbands enforced it as law. Society celebrated women who endured without complaint. To rebel was not only dangerous, but often unthinkable. It was not seen as oppression. It was seen as the natural order. And so, women's lives in castles became a constant balancing act of survival, silence, and sacrifice. Their voices rarely echoed beyond those walls, but the suffering they endured was woven into the very stones of the fortress. But this was not the end of their struggles. Beyond obedience and control, castle women faced another burden that made their lives brutal: the endless labor of survival during times of war and siege. When men marched away to battle, the responsibility of defending and sustaining the castle often fell on women. And what they endured in those moments reveals another shocking truth. Castles, rather than being places of safety, became prisons of terror for the women trapped inside them. When war erupted, the castle became a stage for horror, and women were trapped at its center. Imagine standing on the battlements as enemy armies gathered outside the walls. Men spoke of honor, strategy, and defense. But for women, the meaning of war was different. You were not a knight with a sword, nor a general commanding troops. You were a wife, a mother, a daughter, and in war, that meant vulnerability. Food ran scarce, disease spread, and fear pressed against you like the cold stone walls. You had nowhere to flee, no escape route. The very fortress that promised protection now became a prison, locking you inside with hunger and terror. For days or months, you might not know whether you would survive, and each passing hour felt like a cruel test of endurance. During a siege, women often bore the heaviest sacrifices. As food dwindled, rations went first to soldiers and men of rank. Women and children were expected to eat last, surviving on scraps, thin broth, or nothing at all. Some chronicles describe women so starved that they boiled leather or chewed grass in desperation. Malnutrition weakened their bodies, leaving them vulnerable to illness. Mothers sometimes gave their small portions to their children, slowly wasting away themselves. Imagine holding your child, knowing you must starve so they may survive another day. In these moments, a castle was no longer a symbol of wealth or status. It was a slow and suffocating tomb. But hunger was not the only threat. Disease spread rapidly within castle walls during sieges. The cramped quarters, poor sanitation, and weakened bodies created the perfect breeding ground for plague, fever, and infection. Women, often tasked with nursing the sick, were exposed constantly to disease. There was no escaping the stench of death. Corpses piled up, and the sounds of coughing and moaning filled the halls. Midwives, healers, and ordinary women became desperate caregivers, fighting illnesses they could not cure. The castle, once filled with noise and life, turned into a morgue where death crept from chamber to chamber. The silence that followed each death was heavy, but the siege went on, demanding more sacrifices. And if the castle walls finally fell, women's fates were even darker. For enemy soldiers, conquered women were often treated as spoils of war. Chronicles tell of women captured, abused, enslaved, or taken as concubines. For noblewomen, the humiliation was political as well as personal. They could be forced into marriages with victors or paraded as trophies. Queens and ladies could be imprisoned in distant towers, cut off from everything they knew. Servant women and peasants fared worse, often left defenseless against violence. Imagine hearing the gates crash open, the clash of swords echoing, knowing that the conquerors would see you not as human but as property. The terror of those moments was not forgotten, even centuries later. The silence of those stories tells us how unspeakable they were. Even in times when the walls held, women endured the psychological torment of war. The endless waiting, the sleepless nights, the sound of enemy drums outside, and the uncertainty of survival. All of it ate away at the spirit. Letters from later centuries describe women sitting in their chambers, whispering prayers, clutching rosaries, or weeping quietly. Hope flickered like the flame of a candle, easily extinguished by fear. And yet, through it all, women were expected to remain composed, to comfort children, to stand beside their husbands with quiet strength. Their suffering was invisible, masked by duty. Castles demanded bravery from women, but not the kind sung in ballads or remembered in chronicles. It was the silent bravery of survival. What's even more shocking is that sometimes women were forced into the role of defenders. When men were absent or killed, noblewomen took charge of castles under siege. They organized defenses, rationed food, and even commanded soldiers. Names like Nihola de la Haye in England or Jeanne de Clisson in France survived history for their defiance. Yet even when women proved capable, their bravery was dismissed as exceptional, not natural. The expectation remained. Women were caretakers, not leaders. And so, even in moments of strength, the weight of society's judgment pressed heavily. They could save hundreds of lives, but still be remembered only for their obedience to men. The brutality of castle life for women was not just physical, it was psychological, emotional, and generational. War revealed it most brutally, stripping away any illusion of safety. For women, survival was not just enduring hunger or violence, it was enduring invisibility. Their stories were rarely told, their voices rarely recorded, and their pain was buried beneath the legends of knights and kings. But behind every siege, every stone wall, and every bloody victory, there were women suffering in silence. And in the next part, we'll explore another layer of this brutality. The strict expectations of honor and reputation that suffocated women, even in times of peace, leaving them prisoners of gossip, scandal, and shame. If starvation and siege did not break women, reputation often did. In a medieval castle, your honor was more fragile than glass. A single rumor, a whispered accusation, could destroy everything. Unlike men, whose bravery in war or politics could repair their reputation, women's worth rested almost entirely on their chastity, obedience, and silence. Imagine walking through a grand hall, every eye watching, every whisper weighing on you. A servant's gossip, a rival's jealousy, or even a harmless encounter with a man could spark scandal. And once your name was tainted, there was no escape. Castles were not just fortresses of stone, they were fortresses of reputation, where honor could imprison you more tightly than walls ever could. Women were judged by impossible standards. You had to be beautiful but modest, obedient but dignified, fertile but discreet, pious but not overly ambitious. Stray even slightly from these expectations, and criticism would rain down. If you laughed too freely, you risked appearing frivolous. If you spoke too boldly, you risked being called unruly. If you wore your wealth too proudly, you risked envy and scorn. In a castle filled with rival families, ambitious courtiers, and suspicious men, every gesture could be misinterpreted. Imagine living every day in a performance, shaping every word and every look to avoid disgrace. It was not a life of freedom. It was a stage where you were always being watched. For noblewomen, scandal could have political consequences. A rumor of infidelity was not just personal shame. It could shatter alliances, break treaties, or spark conflict. Families guarded their daughters' reputations fiercely, because a tarnished woman could no longer be used as a pawn in marriage negotiations. Kings and lords treated their wives as symbols of legitimacy. If a queen was accused of adultery, even falsely, it cast doubt on her children's claim to the throne. Consider the fate of Anne Boleyn centuries later. Whispers of disloyalty, combined with political scheming, sealed her doom. Though her case was Tudor rather than medieval, it shows the power of scandal. For women in castles, their lives depended not only on what they did, but what others believed they had done. Even queens lived in fear of their honor being questioned. In France, the scandal of the Tour de Nesle affair in the 14th century exposed how deadly these accusations could be. Several noblewomen, including daughters-in-law of King Philip IV, were accused of adultery. Whether true or not, the accusations led to brutal punishments, imprisonment, and executions of their supposed lovers. The women were disgraced, their names stained forever. The message was clear. One whisper could end your life, your marriage, and your legacy. Castles, which promised security, were also traps of gossip where women had no power to defend their reputations once rumors spread. What made this even more brutal was the hypocrisy. Men were rarely judged by the same standards. Lords openly visited brothels, knights boasted of their conquests, and kings fathered illegitimate children with little consequence. Their reputations, if anything, were burnished by tales of virility. But a woman caught, even in the suspicion of impropriety, was ruined. This double standard crushed women under an unbearable weight. It was not enough to survive childbirth, labor, war, or isolation. You had to survive the scrutiny of every eye, every whisper, every expectation. For women, reputation was not just fragile, it was a noose, tightening with every misstep. To escape scandal, many women withdrew into silence. They hid their feelings, restrained their desires, and lived carefully constructed lives of caution. Some sought safety in religion, retreating into piety to shield themselves from gossip. Others endured quietly, knowing that speaking out would only draw more suspicion. Yet this silence carried its own cruelty. Imagine holding your tongue as your husband flaunted mistresses, or biting back tears when accused of faults you never committed. The stone walls of the castle echoed with the weight of unspoken words, unexpressed dreams, and silenced truths. For women, survival often meant erasing themselves to avoid destruction. But reputation was not the only silent killer in castles. Alongside scandal came another, equally brutal force: the endless cycle of invisibility. Women were often erased from chronicles, their labor, pain, and endurance dismissed as unworthy of record. Their names faded while men's deeds filled the pages of history. And in the next part, we uncover how women's invisibility in the very chronicles of the age made their suffering even more brutal, leaving us only fragments, whispers, and forgotten traces of the lives they endured behind the stone walls of medieval castles. Perhaps the most brutal fate for women in medieval castles was not just suffering hunger, control, or scandal. It was being forgotten. Open any medieval chronicle, and you'll find pages filled with the names of kings, knights, and lords. But the women who carried the weight of survival in these fortresses, often appear only as shadows. The wife of, the daughter of, the widow of. Their stories were silenced even as they endured some of the harshest realities of castle life. Imagine living your entire life managing households, surviving childbirth, enduring sieges, and maintaining reputations, only to vanish from memory. Your voice was not preserved. Your struggles left no trace. This erasure was itself a cruelty, leaving us today with fragments rather than full lives. We can catch glimpses of these women in scattered letters, legal records, and accounts of extraordinary events. When castles were besieged, sometimes a chronicler would note a lady's bravery in passing. When noblewomen acted as regents or defenders, their names occasionally emerged, but for the vast majority, silence was their legacy. Even queens, surrounded by power, were often remembered only through the men connected to them. Their individuality, their voices, their suffering, all dissolved into invisibility. The stone walls that confined them in life also swallowed their memory in death. History, written largely by men, erased the daily brutality endured by women. Yet invisibility does not mean Women were the backbone of castle life. They managed households, raised heirs, preserved alliances, and ensured survival during times of war and famine. Without their labor and endurance, castles would not have functioned. Still, recognition was denied. Society applauded knights for their victories, but ignored the women who kept their fortresses alive. This silence was perhaps the cruelest reality of all, to suffer immensely and yet be denied acknowledgement. For women, survival was not rewarded with legacy. It was swallowed by the shadows of history, leaving us to piece together their existence from the faintest of clues. Think of the servant women who scrubbed floors until their hands bled, yet whose names never appeared in a single record. Think of the noblewomen who gave birth to 10 children, losing half in infancy, only to be remembered as mother of heirs. Think of those accused of scandal, punished, and forgotten. These lives, erased from the grand stories of kings and wars, were just as real, just as brutal. The castle, for women, was a stage of suffering whose audience never recorded their performance. Their absence from history books does not lessen the pain they endured. It magnifies the injustice. And yet, when you walk today through the ruins of a medieval castle, you can feel their presence. The echo of footsteps on cold stone floors, the draft through broken windows, the darkness of narrow chambers, all whisper of their forgotten lives. The silence of those walls is not empty. It is filled with untold stories. Every stone bears witness to the invisible labor, the hushed prayers, the muffled cries of women who lived and died behind them. History may have silenced their voices, but the ruins still carry their echoes. And in those echoes, you can almost hear the truth. Life in a medieval castle was never a fairy tale. For women, it was endurance, sacrifice, and silence. The most shocking truth of all is that brutality was not considered brutality then. It was the natural order. Women were expected to endure hunger, fear, and invisibility without complaint. What we see as cruelty, they were told, was duty. And so, the cycle repeated across generations. Daughters raised under this weight grew into women who carried it themselves, passing it silently to the next. The castle's towers stood tall, but its women's voices remained buried. Their erasure was not accidental, it was intentional. A reinforcement of power that made women's survival possible but their stories expendable. So the next time you picture a medieval castle, the knights, the feasts, the pageantry, remember what those walls truly held. Behind the grandeur lay suffering. Behind the legends lay silence. The lives of women in castles were not gilded with romance, but shadowed with brutality. They survived starvation, isolation, control, gossip, and erasure, all while appearing graceful and obedient. And though history tried to erase them, their endurance carved its mark in stone. Castles may have been built for kings, but they were endured by women. And perhaps the greatest injustice is that we must dig through silence just to find the faintest fragments of their truth.